on combating the erasure of Black identity. Can you speak to the ways Black erasure plays out in West Virginia and the impact it has on Blacks in West Virginia? And you can also tell us about you and why you do this work. Why this work?
Someone sent me a message on Twitter yesterday and asked if this was who I was, if I had always been, since I was a little girl. That was the question. Have you always been, trying to amplify the voices of Black people in West Virginia? And and I had to think about it. And I thought, my goodness, I really have been curious and trying to understand, because, when you're a child and you look around, you question things differently, and, you wonder what's missing, right? And so I think from a very early age, I understood the sort of, the flying WVs and the West Virginia sort of like rah-rah that so many people have. And, where was that for Black people? And that's when I started to discover history. And the more I discovered history, the more I understood that Black people in West Virginia have had a powerful presence. But that history is not always front and center in our textbooks. It's not front and center in the way that the media frames West Virginia. And since we're talking about West Virginia today, Reverend English, I'll just keep it there. And when I say West Virginia, I mean the greater Appalachia too, right? And so, yeah, so, as far as my work, my work is to be me and to keep exploring who I am in context of how do I help other people and help my, myself. And so I don't want to carry this sort of narrative of like I speak for the voiceless people, which so many people say when they talk about Appalachia. And I think that's sort of like ridiculous in a sense. Just pass the mic, let the people that don't have a voice, that you think don't have a voice, speak if you have the microphone. But, I really think that where we are today is in a narrative that centers white Appalachia, and we can see it most commonly in the opioid crisis, right? And so one of the things that I'm doing with Black by God, and just to kind of like answer your question, Bishop, is that when people think of the opioid crisis in Appalachia and in West Virginia, which is the capital, I guess. It impacts white people. It impacts poor white people, and that's always the story. And very rarely anywhere is the story being told of how the opioid crisis has impacted Black West Virginians and Black families. That's all the way from the prison system to addiction to the children. And so, not to tell the sad story, but it's just the truth. Anything that's happening to poor white people in Appalachia is 2 times worse for Black folks. And that's from infant mortality rate to drug addiction, you name it. And so I think, yesterday I was in the water in front of Joe Manchin's houseboat, reminding him to build back better, which I loved that you said that. And one of the things is that with this infrastructure bill, and with anything, if you help the least, you help the most, right? And so when I think of West Virginia and I think of how people think of poor white poverty, recognize that inside that, not everybody is white, and that quote unquote poverty impacts those people greater. So what we have to do is be visible, because we're invisible in this narrative. I mean, we have had how many years of people telling the opioid story, and not once have you heard the stories that I live with of grandmothers and mothers that got addicted to pain pills and that are gone now, because, nobody's asking the question. So I hope that it's a long answer, but thank you for opening up the door for me to tell a little bit about myself, because, I think really as a poet and a storyteller and in creating Black by God, I just want to elevate the stories for visibility and then let the people speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I love how that's the thing. We say we're speaking for the voiceless, but the reason why they're voiceless is because we don't pass the bullhorn. We don't pass the mic. And so people become irritated with that. And when you bring up the opioid crisis, I mean, I think you are tapping across the Ohio River Valley like, like never before, because I know West Virginia and Ohio and I think it was one other state, may have been New Hampshire, had the highest rates with regards to the opioid crisis. And I had the same pushback that you had, or that you have. Is like, where are the stories of Black families being impacted by this? Where are the stories where, we're talking about the trauma that the parents, because if your child is suffering from substance abuse disorder, or, then the whole family suffers, the community suffers, and we don't talk about that. And interestingly enough, there's a narrative, as you were saying, that we have to break there. I remember challenging somebody, a funder, as a matter of fact, and I said, do you only think white people should be healed? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, because you only fund harm reduction for white people. And Black people suffer at higher rates of overdose. And nobody is talking about it. When it was a war on drugs, oh, it made the news. But then when it became the sheriff's daughter sitting, or, she passed away in the middle of the street, it became a crisis. And we have to pay attention to how things are talked about, that continue to create the erasure and invisibilize us. So I want to thank you for that, because that is an area that, when we think of systems that connect all systems frontwards, from the back end to the front end, and really the back end is the economics, or the front end is the economics, and the back end is the criminal justice system, and not realizing how the criminal justice system, the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, and the hospitals are all connected and continuing to perpetuate the annihilation of Black families and the invisibility of who we are and our voices. So thank you again for that. Reverend English, I want to go back to you for one moment, Crystal. You said, and I think I'd like for you to expound on this a little more. You said that, you're telling the story of me. And I think that's so powerful. How do we encourage people to tell the story of themselves and feel safe enough to do so?
Well, I think maybe it starts with, sharing other people's stories. Sharing other people's stories from your community, from your town, from Black by God, just, starting to share and amplify other voices. And then I think that's sort of how you find your own voice. It is scary to share parts of yourself or to share your vulnerabilities. The reason that I am deeply invested in telling the stories of Black Appalachians in recovery is because I am a Black Appalachian in recovery, and I know what it's like to go through those systems that are there, right? So if you're talking about, any of the recovery meetings and recovery groups, I wrote a piece about this for Scallywag, about what it was like to try to get sober inside Appalachia's programming, which is very white. And that's where I started to realize, where are the Black people, and why is the priority for alternative sentencing, right? Which I noticed was predominantly white mothers, right? And that's important. I don't want anybody's mother to go to jail when they could go to rehab. But I also noticed that it was, with my eyes, predominantly white women. So that, with knowing what we know about the criminal justice system, we know that if you are Black, you are seen as a criminal, not as an addict, right? So if you look at the sentencing of who gets alternative sentencing in West Virginia and Appalachia, or what they call it, like drug court, right? It's predominantly white women. And to me, that was a hard pause. So once I got my legs underneath my feet, I have to raise my hand and say, hey, I went through this, which is not something I really want to tell. I don't want to tell people about my struggles with alcohol, but I need to be visible, right? So that somebody else can maybe see themselves or their neighbor or somebody in my story. And I think a lot of times social media, things like that, lend us to kind of like, tell our story. But if you have something in your heart, you know what I mean? If you have a part of you that you feel vulnerable about, or that you think could help somebody, I do challenge you to share that and tell that. And maybe that's a story about racism, or maybe that's a positive story. But I mean, framing things and owning and claiming who you are and where you're from. And, you know, it really releases people to feel like they're not the only one, which is something that we feel just by nature of geography, very isolated in Appalachia. So I hope that answers your question.
It beautifully answers my question. And thank you for allowing us to witness you and to share some very vulnerable parts of you. I don't take that lightly. I'm honored that you even trust us enough to share that. And I hope that this encourages the next person to not have to hide, but to feel like they too can raise their hand. Thank you so much. Moving over to you, Reverend English. We can do one of two things, because I know we want to show a snippet of the Triangle District in West Virginia, but we can start with you speaking. You know, you moved to West Virginia, and you know, with all that's going on in West Virginia and all of the tensions and everything and things that Crystal has mentioned, you had an opportunity. You could have like said, I could go back to Atlanta. Why did you stay in Virginia? Why did you choose to continue to stay rooted in West Virginia?
Okay. First, the clip that you just made in terms of one reason I stayed in West Virginia is because after I came here, pastored First Baptist Church, everybody that I knew that knew me from Atlanta, I would meet in national conventions, and they say, "Where are you?" I'm in First Baptist. Oh yeah, that's in Virginia. I said, no, that is West by God, Virginia. And I can understand why Crystal chose to name her media platform West by God, Virginia, because part of the identity crisis that Black folk have when they travel is being confused with being labeled as part of Virginia. And that is a uniqueness about that. The other thing I appreciated the fact that this is the first time that Crystal and I have had the opportunity of sharing this kind of platform, where she has already given witness to one of the reasons for my deep appreciation of her and her emergence through the recovering community, and the way that that story is so powerful. Also, her focus on stories, because the power of stories, particularly in this area, is one that is unique across the board in terms of how Appalachian stories just have that kind of unique character because of where it takes place, why it takes place. And it also reveals three very important things in terms of how social institutions, educational institutions have shared a common fate. And that is, what is the cause of that initiation in terms of why they got started? What is the measure of their impact in terms of what their intention was for getting started? And when you look at Black institutions like West Virginia State College now, and then other Black institutions that have developed in the West Virginia complex, you can really see the connection and how this has been a part of its history, and how the current conversation and focus on it is really saying something that has been known for a long time, but has not been exposed in terms of the president of the Charleston branch NAACP. And the NAACP started, and it was initiated by the Niagara movement, which took place in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. One of my predecessors at First Baptist Church in his lineage is from a church founded in a town outside of West Virginia, where Booker T. Washington taught high school, taught school, but also where he was raised. So those are the kinds of connections that have been a part of the reason that I have been intrigued with the place. Part of the reason I decided to stay in this space, because of what the continuing learning experience has come. from being here. Then going specifically to the introduction to the Triangle District film. When I came here in 1972, the Triangle District was just being destroyed. And I didn't know the story behind the Triangle District until after I had been here a while. And some people were really talking about the cultural impact that it had on the development and the destruction of the African-American community in Charleston and the extended impact as far as West Virginia. Because I actually was pastor in First Baptist as I actually saw the four-way highway system, interstate system of 64 and 74 running through the heart of downtown. Well, at first I thought that that was a great thing because it's one of the unique spaces and places that I had seen a highway system running through the heart of the city, but then come to know how that had impacted the community because I had members who had been residents of that community and had talked about how vibrant that community was from the standpoint of its socialization, of the clubs, of the Black entrepreneurship that was there, the Black connections that were there, even the relationship between the police and the community, because there were police officers that became legends in that community because of how they looked out for that community, but how the community looked out for them. And that's the kind of connection we're trying to get with police officers now. So there were a lot of things going on that intrigued me about the Triangle District that only became enriched by coming to awareness of the story of that district and the impact, both in terms of how it destroyed the spirit, but how in situations like that, that is a spirit that cannot be denied or that cannot be defied, but often become resurrected in succeeding situations where the legacy of that story has a fresh impact.
So let's take a minute.
That's exactly what happened in terms of my experience in the Triangle.
Let's take a minute and look at, and we know that this happened in like the 60s, moved up and, way into the 70s. Let's take a minute to look at what you're talking about or what you're addressing, Reverend English. We'll have about a 3-minute snippet. It's a little longer, but we're going to just focus on probably like a little over 3 minutes. Right. And then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
So-called good people, the so-called silent majority, I don't think they really are aware of what goes on in the country. See, this is supposed to be a country that's founded on religion also. You are your brother's keeper, whether you want it to be or not. We have the Bible held up today, every day of our lives. Most people go on to make their living because they're living good and have no problem. They don't think about it.
We have a couple of instances where the state roads have some notice for people to move out, and I think they only give them about, a week or two. And with some of these people, they only make their own people. Most of them are on, of a monthly check. I think they only amount to about $64 a month, which they pay about $30 a month in rent. And with the house they live in now, I think it's about 7 tenants in the house, and they only have just 1 bathroom. I don't think there's any hot water whatsoever. It's owned by the state road. And I really think that the state road is really responsible for relocation as well as the city.
The residents of this community are tired now, and we're fed up with all of the promises that have been made and none being carried out. We're tired of the social problems that have been created in our community and no social reform programs. We're tired of our homes being gutted while we are yet living in them and nowhere to run to but to the hills. We are tired of having to tell residents that money is available to relocate, houses to relocate in, and yet at the same time there is no money and no houses. We are tired of being moved about, our children suffering, not knowing where to go or what to do.
Your police force has come in for a lot of praise for their restraint. Were there any special orders given out before the triangle situation?
Not anything particular any more than our regular training, that we just use what force is necessary and we restrain ourselves and do the job with as little damage to ourselves and other people as we can. That doesn't mean that we're going to stand up and get killed or get knocked in the head. We're going to protect ourselves.
The city police are down in this area? Well, at the present time, we would say it is fine, but there are several police officers who have had quite a few complaints, and we have discussed it with Mayor Dawson.
You're demanding the firing of Mr. Hemphill, the resignation of the entire authority on fault of demolition. Then you say you'll do whatever is necessary to achieve those demands. What do you mean by that?
Well, what we really mean, that we mean any means that's legally, any means that that is at our disposal in order to stop it and to bring attention to the fact that they're not dealing with the residents as they ought to.
Are you saying it could be another hot summer in the triangle such as one?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Are we?
Wow. Yeah.
I love that clip. I love that clip so much because it empowers me. It shows me the fight. You know what I mean? It really does. I was actually watching that. I didn't know you were going to play it. I was watching that earlier today because I was thinking about, you know, what's lost, right? The stories that are lost, and that when we lose, I feel like Charleston has lost that fight, that connection, you know what I mean? Because after a while, people just get beat down, you know what I mean? And the stories gets lost and the families gets displaced, and, you know, and so Reverend English and coming into the Triangle District and hearing, you know, and hearing your stories, those are the things that are so important to me as a catalyst to keep going. Because listen, starting a Black newspaper in West Virginia and the, you know, is it's a lot of work on my credit card. You know what I mean? You know, I mean, you know, getting started is tough, right? But I know on the other side, there's grants and things like that, but getting started is tough. And this is the part where people want to, like, you know, kind of give up, but I have to anchor myself. And I didn't mean to, I'm hyping myself up right now because I'm encouraged. You know what I mean? Like, I have to those stories, those clips, that reminds me, okay, we got to keep pushing. We're always pushing. We cannot quit, even if we lose, right? Even, and the interstate came through, and now guess what? Reverend English, you could tell them the mall went foreclosed. Every piece of property that they developed.
Yeah.
Definitely would like for you to build upon what Crystal said, Reverend English, because I think people don't realize the impact of Black migration and displacement, and the impact, not just at that moment, but the perpetual impact that it continues to have, and the losses that are suffered, not at a minimalistic way. You know, this is like in a macro way. So definitely, you know, please build upon, you know, what you saw after the fact in your pastoring, the stories that you have heard, you know, and what is it like now? I mean, and you and Crystal can kind of speak to that, you know.
Yeah, I was almost, I had the impulse to jump right in after the film, but I said, I want to hear Crystal first. Two things came out of that film, and one thing that she just mentioned brings to mind one of the great lessons of history, when she talked about how the disruption of the triangle was preparing the space for the mall. And now you look at the space of the mall and see that there's plenty of space in the mall. And it reminds me of one of the great lessons of history: the mills of God grind slowly, yet exceedingly fine. And that is a arc in the moral universe that brings about that kind of illustration of what happens when a people are decimated by that process in order to expand land that comes from taking land. And we know that in this country, as Malcolm often reminded us, that the primary movements that have made impact on the American system of enterprise and politics has always been about land. I mean, that's the reason that we were brought here, in order to cultivate land for the production of tobacco and those kind of things. So that's the first thing that's kind of hit me, how biblically that's grounded in a fundamental truth about the universe. Secondly, that clip, I believe, Bishop, that you might have been inspired to without even knowing it. That clip showed Reverend Harold Carter, who was the pastor of the Shiloh Baptist Church, which was within walking distance of Charleston. And when he discovered that I came here and where I was from, he was the first pastor that I met. And that we bonded in such a way as far as our allegiance to social change and those kind of issues. And he was already grounded in it, and he became my tutor. That when the garbage worker strike took place in Charleston, and it was really taking root, taking its lineage from the garbage worker strike in Memphis. And then because of my association with Dr. King, and that's how I kind of got drawn into it. Not by the NAACP, because they were not really active in that struggle, but by the union. And so the leadership of the union got in touch with me by way of Reverend Carter. So Reverend Carter and I wound up sitting overnight in a movement at the Charleston mayor's office, at the time. And I just remember how much fun we had just participating in that movement that was intended to deal with equal wages for those garbage workers. And so that was kind of attended to the movement that Dr. King had led. So that's how we met. So it was no surprise to me that he had already had and was kind of standing alone, because he was not a native of Charleston. He came here to pastor that church, and therefore he and I were sharing common ground at being new to the city at the time of this particular transition. And so we kind of came connected by way of that struggle. And I just kind of appreciated how that clip showed his commitment. And it also showed how the leadership, ground roots leadership in Charleston, was a part of the Triangle District. So it wasn't the president of the Charleston branch, NAACP, or any other organization that were predominantly Black that took leadership in that movement. It was the ground roots folk in the neighborhood who connected with each other because of that connection in the Triangle District that said, we are not going to sit down and take this. We know that this is something that we must bind ourselves. And when you look at the direction of the city and how there has been often notions about how Black folk don't get along and all that was one of those situations where the binding and the bonding in the struggle really reveal the sources of leadership in the community, how it was not dependent on outside forces to raise the issue and raise it in such a way that it got attention, even though it did not get the desired results. It made a significant impact on the leadership of the community that is still resident, and I think really led to the forming of that film, which really was done several years after. So they had to go and find footage from that time in order to produce that film.
Wow, thank you. What stood out to me, one was, being one who is Black clergy, I often wonder, like, where did we lose the energy in the fight? Because as you said, it was clergy leading the fight then. And I often hear so many people ask, where is the Black church? And then when I go to the Black church and say, where are you? Are you on life support? What's going on? What's happening? Then I hear, well, we don't know where we should stand. And that kind of gets me like, you don't know where you should stand because there's a moral imperative. There's a human imperative inside of here. And like you said, it's rooted in the word. And if you are going to say that I am living by this word, then part of that word is justice, not just us, but justice. And so I'm always inspired and I'm always questioning, how do we get back to that point? How do we bring the Black church, which also had a rich history in the community, which was the backbone of the community. And as you said, the community stood up. It wasn't any white saviorism in there. It could have been something, what I heard you say is that, police and everybody got along. But at the end of the day, they were strong, they were fortified enough to stand together. And so I both inspired, but also saddened by the fact that, the Black church has a very strong voice, but also, saddened by right now it's at a whisper, and you just have certain ones speaking out. So, I mean, I don't think I'm looking for an answer. I think I'm just kind of venting because in this space because I'm even wrestling myself. So I get it. I want to pose this question to both you and Crystal. Oh, you had something you wanted to say, Reverend English?
Yeah, well, when you mentioned Black church response, I do have to admit a kind of ambivalence about the Black church leadership and impact in Charleston, because First Baptist Church was really known to be the First Baptist Church. Not just in West Virginia, I mean, just in Charleston, but in West Virginia, because of the history of the preachers who had come out of First Baptist Church, one of which was Vernon Johns. And there is a legend about Vernon Johns that, you probably have seen. But while he was there, he was pastor for 2 tenures. He was dismissed and then he came back. But Vernon Johns left First Baptist and went to become pastor of Montgomery, of Dexter Avenue in Montgomery. Mordecai Johnson, who had served there for about 5 years, left First Baptist and became president of Howard University. And that had been J. Raymond Henderson had been there. So that was a lineage of pastors in the history of First Baptist that left there at West Virginia and made significant impact in the African-American movement, African-American institutions, from West. So they were kind of like seated in that space. And then there were lawyers, T.G. Nutter, who became legendary in his time. At the time that I came, Brown Realty, Della Brown Taylor, who was a professor at West Virginia State College, was from there. And he had been, Brown Realtor had been very active in the civil rights struggle that had been a part of Charleston at that time. So the leadership from First Baptist had made significant impact on the community. The fellowship is another story. Because it was a very, first class kind of church. And everybody, you know, just didn't show up there unless you had some kind of connection with people in the community. And so that was a resource that was there. But in terms of the connection that made impact in the community, that was a kind of another story, and which was often true of many so-called middle-class Black churches in that era. But the story in the story has always been one that I found personally encouraging and kind of kept, and that was really what drew my attention here, because as they were looking for a pastor, one of the members of the church called Daddy King, said, "We're looking for a pastor and we want to know if you had any suggestions." And she happened to know me, and I mean, Daddy King told me about her, and that's how that connection got here. And I became a part of the membership committee. I mean, the pastoral committee asked me to come, and then that was how I came here. But it was primarily because of somebody in the church who knew Daddy King and asked me about coming here that my connection with First Baptist was established. And so that's how there's been that kind of ambivalence in terms of appreciating the legacy of that church, the leadership of that church, and the potential, you know, that it had. I'm glad to see how that really has been resurrected under the current leader, Paul Anthony Dunn, who has been very active in this community and has really revived both the history and the impact of that church by way of his community service.
Thank you, Reverend English. Crystal, I see you.
Well,
Yeah, you want to piggyback off of that?
So Bishop, Reverend, I don't have any titles, but what I do think, what Reverend English, when you said fun, when you said you had fun in the garbage strike in Charleston, right? I think that is part of what this movement and what is also the resistance, right? It's fun, it's joy. And I had fun yesterday protesting, asking Joe Manchin to please build back better. And I'm gonna get ready to show y'all something, because do you know who this, can you see this picture here? Let's see, this is me.
It's Warnock.
Yeah, it's me and Reverend Warnock. And I got to show him my cartoon that I drew of him for Black by God with Joe Manchin. You can go check that out on Black by God. But what happened was I said, Reverend Sharp, I'm Crystal from West Virginia. And the first thing he did was start naming clergy and ask me if I knew people that he knew and connected, right? So the church is so powerful in terms of organizing. And I hear and I see and I feel just even my children's connection to the church is much different than mine. But what I know is that the movement, right? The movement is, the church was the organizing for the movement. And now the movement has to be the organizing, I believe, for the spiritual, right? And also it's just we have to think in new modalities, right? We have to think in new ways. We always imagined church was this, church is something else now, I believe, right? And I believe it's so necessary because, as you said, we're losing generations and we're losing things, but the movement, right? Even in the journalism that I do, and that I'm working to create, it's called movement journalism, right? I am centering the liberation of people, right? I'm not trying to tell a story that's partial to and fair, quote unquote, to conservatives or Republicans, or trying to, do that. I am trying to be centered in movement journalism, which is a new term, right? Which is a new way of looking at journalism, right? Where we're so used to. And I think that where we are in time is a reimagining of what the church looks like, right? I believe we're in church right now. I believe that we are, and so it's a different way of looking at how it works, which is what our people have always done before we had a church building, right? Before we had a First Baptist, for people to be, I'll go ahead and say it for you, bougie in the pews, right? So I think that it's just, we're as much as we're imagining like what technology brings us, but that was a beautiful moment to say, hey, Senator Shar, I'm from West Virginia, and he stopped And his first thing he said, "You are?" I said, yes, I'm 6 generations. And then he immediately went into like naming the people that he knows from West Virginia that are strong Black clergy. Sorry, I can't remember their names. But it was this connection, affinity that people that religious leaders have with each other, right? And that they're able to carry the message. I mean, even Reverend English write down, the mills of God. I love being in the presence of the church, of the clergy, because it is movement. It's not separate for me. You know what I mean? But I think that a lot of our young people, the building is what's keeping people out of it. But the movement, right? This work that I think that we're talking about, that is the church, and we just have to reimagine a different way. And even hearing Reverend English, who is the president of the Charleston NAACP, right? Talking about how, generations back, the NAACP was not involved in the garbage strike. It was led by grassroots young people, right? And so I think, I am only a member of the Charleston NAACP because Reverend English is the president, because it comes with this history of what have you done, right? How do I see it? So, I love it. I love it when Reverend English talks about the radical king, and I think that's like, the radical Dr. Martin Luther King, which so often gets forgotten in the narrative. But, I think that we're all just in a place to reimagine what all of this looks like and what it means. How do we love people, and how do we take care of each other? So I'll pause there. But
Well, I thank you, because that really is a good segue. You talked about at a point of reimagining. I love the fact of, the church without walls, because that's my concept for my ministry, church without walls. But I want to pose this question to both you and Reverend English, and understanding that, racial discrimination still affects how communities are developed and how funding is distributed amongst different neighborhoods, which exacerbates the health and well-being of Black families. What types of public and private investments must be provided to mitigate, mend, and economically repair the damage due to both present and historical inequities? How do we reimagine? How do we rebuild? And how do we hold the federal government? We've got to build back better language, but we know it's going to trickle down. So how do we gather, West Virginians together to build a plan to ensure that this public investment, this private investment, is reaching the communities that need to be, as I said, mitigated, mended, and economically repaired?
One thing that immediately comes to mind when you raise that question is the issue is clear in terms of how the necessity of that kind of economic empowerment is strengthened and resourced by the community's empowerment. The reality also is dealing with how now, and Crystal, you might have more current information about the Black population, but I think we may now be around about 5% of the population in West Virginia. When I came here, it was considerably higher than that. So when you talk about the pooling of resources, you definitely have to talk about what are the possibilities of pooling with resources and connection in the community where you share common ground. And that's how the raising of the awareness of the issue and the need for that kind of resource of economic and political power is critical to the kind of impact that we have anticipated and see the need of. Now, having said that, it amazes me, and that's the reason I'm really grateful for Crystal's presence and her connection that she has already made with us as far as the recovery community. Because I think that recovery or reimagining is really the process of recovering the resources that are already at hand, but not quite in hand in the way that we need them to be, but at least raising the awareness of that kind of possibility, organized around a different leadership model, makes for a possible difference. Now, I came to the branch of the Charleston branch NAACP reluctantly, really, because it was kind of like in a stale mode, and had the idea of building the branch by what I call resource exchange. Crystal is an example of that. I know that she can be a resource to the connection and to the community strategy or communication strategy of the Charleston branch. And we can be a resource to her in terms of what she's doing in Black by God, because as a member of our communications committee, she's naturally letting us be aware of what they are about, not only in terms of that strategy, but in terms of their issues. And so, and we do that with reference to other organizations, legal redress committee, lawyers who have been active in the community, religious leaders, and I've really been encouraged by the communications committee and 2 or 3 others. So as we build community, as we build the committees that comprise the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, then we are dealing with that structure. We're dealing with that organization, but we're also making application in the local area by saying that these are the ways in which we can resource you if you resource us. And so we're not telling you you ought to be a member of the NAACP because you ought to. No, we're saying you see what we are doing. You see the kind of need we are trying to address. And you want to become a part of the NAACP because you want to be involved, and you want to be up to what we are up to. And if you are up to what we are up to, then we can make a difference. So that's the process by which we are trying to rebuild and reconnect the resources within the community with the institutions that are outside of our immediate community, but that we have now access to by way of some of the representatives on local committee organization, through the mayor's office and that kind of thing. And particularly the work that we're doing with the police, that's a whole nother story. But I think we have a game changer in terms of how we have introduced an instrument to the Charleston police that is now going statewide, where we are using a book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And the jewel of that book is that it starts with a personal assessment of one's emotional intelligence according to a certain kind of categories. And then they can make their own assessment about where they fit. So when police use that kind of assessment, it's not about somebody telling them what they ought to do. It's about them becoming aware of what their attitude is that impacts decisions that they make on a daily basis and might impact a decision that they make of using deadly force in an instant based on that emotional reaction to what they see. And that's why that has gotten the endorsement of the state by way of the governor's office all the way down, that's going to be taught to every police force in the state, including the state troopers. And that has the potential of being a game changer in terms of the community reaction to law enforcement and law enforcement to the community. Thank
you for that, Reverend English. Crystal, same question posed to you. What is the federal investment, the public, the investment that is needed that must be provided, again, to mitigate, mend, and economically repair the damage due to both present and historical inequities and divestment? You're on mute.
I'll try to stay in my lane here, and that is you know, I'm a small independent newspaper and media publisher that's just getting started. And the more I learn that we are in an information crisis. We know that President 3545, right? You know, the first attack was at the media, right? But we also know that when it comes to Black families and Black communities, that Black media just hasn't necessarily even existed in Appalachia, nothing consistent. So you can't miss something that you never had. I want to encourage everyone to please invest time in Media 2070, because to answer the question, it is media reparations. There is legislation on the federal level that would help publishers like me, publishers like you, people to retell the story, to have the tools that everybody else got years ago, right? So I'm really looking at media reparations because I believe that the people don't know what they don't know. And often people that are in policy are talking to each other. And the everyday person doesn't understand. All we hear is the slogans. I'll just use Build Back Better, run over here, fill out this form, do this. And it's not connecting to the people. I think even the way that we do advocacy, right? I don't know whose model that is. I don't know who the great grant maker is up in the sky, right? That decides who gets grants and who doesn't, right? Or what causes matter. I don't know if there's a secret meeting that goes on, but I know that I just think that people are smart enough if they have the information, right? And they can figure out strategies for themselves and for their communities, but often that information doesn't trickle down. So what I'm trying to remedy in my work is to be an information broker, right? And in order for me to be an information broker, I have to remember and remind myself about those wonderful words, equity and inclusion, right? Or that there's not a lot of equity in anything that Black folks are doing, right? We don't start at the same point as other folks, especially when it comes to media. So Media 2070 is a platform that I'm paying attention to because it's helping me understand the challenges of being a Black publisher, but it's also reminding me of how important it is that we are all good brokers of information and passing this on. That's what the church did, right? And that's what we can do now if we empower ourselves with social media and other tools. So to me, in order for us to be able to organize on the side of federal law, and federal policy, we have to know what it is, and we have to be able to broker those messages to each other and understand it, right? I mean, quite often when I'm in policy conversations, I nod my head, and then I have to go Google. I have to do a lot of work behind what's happening in those meetings, right? It's very intimidating. So I want to try to take that out. And I think we all should be able to explain to our neighbors, what is this? What is this bill? What is this? Why does this matter? Especially with, like, you know, the all of the funding that's coming in through counties. You know, it gets very complicated. And I think we just need to be good stewards of information and keep brokering information and not be afraid to, like, ask questions about things that we don't understand. Because I think quite often a lot of people just sort of like parrot information and they don't fully understand it. And then a lot of people just say, I'm just done. I'm checking out. Right. And so in that space is what I'm interested in. Yeah. And I think it all begins with how we tell the story, how we message the story. And it's not just about the slogan of the moment. We have to unpack that slogan of the moment so that everyday people understand what it means for them. And then hopefully they will be more engaged and more involved, and then we'll start to figure out new tools and new resources.
So what I'm hearing you say, Crystal, in a nutshell, and you and Reverend English both, is, you know, that story, number one, it's stories, it's information, it's the sharing, it's understanding community, getting back to that place of knowing what you need. Not that you don't even know what you need, but you don't have enough information to push and to build and to organize, to advocate, you know, for what it is you need. And I'm also hearing, you know, the disservices in the way messages are conveyed, the lack of, you know, political or policy analysis, which I think, you know, we do need to understand these different policies, or to even understand Build Back Better. And I appreciate you saying you're staying in your lane. Because a lot of people would just try to kind of like, guess around the block as to what's needed. And we know that, the overarching thing here is this, repairing the harm is just repairing the harm. And it's like, what does that look like in, for Black people? What does repairing the harm look like? And how do we begin, as you stated, to imagine or reimagine how we build to hold the federal government and other agencies accountable to begin to put it in our hand? Because it's like Reverend English said, it's not that there aren't things that are there, but it's just the things that are not in hand. And what I gathered from this is that, it's about, let's build this bridge. Let's build this circle of people who have the information and knowledge and understanding so that they can build and ask for what it is that they want. Because when we don't know how to ask for what we want, how do we get what we want? Or if we don't understand what we're asking for, how do we really communicate it in such a way that it is a value add to us individually and collectively? So I want to thank you for that. I want to, I think, at this point in time, it is about, just coming back together and telling those stories. So we're going to get ready and close out. And I see, Crystal, you have to go. So I would like to just say, before closing out, I'd like for you to go first, Crystal, and to just give you a few minutes to give some closing remarks, and you can, share how people can connect with you. And if you like, you can put your information in the chat as well.
Thank you. I have enjoyed this. I'm going to put Black by God. Blackbygod.org is where you can go sign up for my newsletter. And please sign up for your newsletter. Just signing up helps me. Read the articles. That's even better. Share the articles. Contribute content. I don't care. Sometimes I get weird questions like, well, can white people read the paper? Yes. And if people want to contribute, I take opinion pieces. Just contact me. The door is open. I also have a secret cartoon editorial board. So if you go on there and you like cartoons and you like the political cartoon, the art of the political cartoon, I do have those are contributed by several different voices, the imagining of those. And so people are welcome to get in where you fit in there with your creative contributions also. So, and support, just support a young, I don't even care if they're young, support a Black content creator from your community. There are people out here that have podcasts. There are people out here that have newsletters. There are people that are contributing on Instagram. Support them, because part of what I'm doing with Black by God is to try to thread all of those content creators. So often we think of like journalism as a newspaper, as a very, sort of like traditional structure. But Black people are inventive and creative, and we are brokering messages across many platforms. And we need to support those people in our communities that are creating content. If you got a beauty blogger in your community and she or he is doing amazing work on YouTube, share that with me, because I'm really trying to build, an inventory of who these folks are, because I believe that's sort of our organizing channel also, right? This is how we share messages, and we have to be inventive and creative about how we're doing that in this century. So as far as this listening session goes, I tell you, I am so excited about some of the things that are happening across, and I know you are too, Bishop Marcia, because we're having a bit of a moment in Black Appalachia, right? A bit of a moment that we've never had before. Books are coming out, television shows. Joe Manchin is putting Black Appalachia at the top of, of the thing. And I think this is a moment where we have to reimagine what that means for ourselves, knowing our past, and then what that means going forward for how we're going to stay connected, in our sort of collective family reunion. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for that. Reverend English, any closing remarks?
Yes, indeed. I really appreciate this forum. I really appreciate this conversation, and it continues to enlighten me on modes and methods of really making the best of this moment, because I do believe that not only is this a critical moment in our state, this is a critical moment in our history in terms of the overlay of the pandemic and the response to racial injustice. Specifically, I want to reference two things that I'm currently involved in that I just kind of want to announce and show, particularly, Bishop Dinkins, since you are involved in one, and that is restorative justice. And I think that restorative justice helps us to identify a process as well as an arrangement by which our listening helps us to understand our connections. And we fortunately have a event coming up in November the 19th. That would be a conference of restorative justice ventures across the state. And the person that we have been able to engage to be the featured speaker is Dr. Howard Zare. Dr. Zare was the first Black graduate of Morehouse College. And we had not made the connection until I asked him or found a way to get to him. And then after we had this classmate conversation, he consented to come, but not to make a speech because he doesn't do that. But he said, Ron, let's have a conversation. I said, that's great, because that means other people who are involved in the restorative justice work that we have been doing with the police, that we have been doing with schools, that we have been doing with communities, and all of those spaces can come to raise questions with the reputed founder of restorative justice. And so I'm just delighted and really excited about that. The other event that I participated in recently was an event at the local Bridge Valley Community College, where they wanted to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion. And the point that I made that is that often events like that are really urged by some kind of requirement that they are made to have such conversations about diversity and inclusion. And even the presence of diversity and inclusion officers are in response to some mandate as required for that university. That means that diversity and inclusion are nouns. They are not adjectives that are requiring action. They are titles of officers. Now, they have the potential in those organizations to really become instruments of change if it is not just according to an agenda that that organization or institution, or particularly educational institution, feel like they got to have in order to be in compliance with whatever funding sources that are needed for that organization. And there's a certain pattern of equity that's required in order to have availability or accessibility to those funding sources. So therefore, diversity and inclusion has to become more than a noun. It has to become an action. It has to become an agenda in which there is a possibility of transformation taking place within institutions, where people become committed to what the impact and the as well as the consistency between the impact and the intent of talking about diversity and inclusion is more than just satisfying a contractual relationship that's required for resources, that it can actually become a resource in itself. So those are the two areas that I'm really excited to be a part of now and have access to the NAACP and the work in restorative justice that I think is a powerful instrument for transformational and personal change.
Thank you for that, because that's what we're seeking out. We're seeking out restoration. We're seeking out transformation, collective healing, awareness, visibility, where our voices are heard, our faces are seen, we are witnessed, our stories are leaned into, and all of those things culminate into a really strong movement. You know, not it's by us, for us, but also we need you to come with us. And people need to understand that. It is not the point that Black people are really trying to say, I want to stay in a silo. What we're saying is we want to be able to live like you live, take care of our children like you take care of our children. Give us the opportunities that we need. We have Black media here. We have the NAACP. There are so many ways that we can heal inside of our stories if we could just get comfortable with voice and visibility. You know, if we can get comfortable with hearing the stories and seeing the invisible become visible, then we can heal individually and collectively, because there's always a story inside of a story. And we know that because that's the only way that policy continues to live. There's a policy inside of a policy inside of a policy that's connected to a story that's inside of a story that's inside of a story. So I want to thank you again, Reverend English and Crystal Good, for joining, you know, us for the second Black listening session in West Virginia. I want to thank you for all that you're doing in the community, with the community, how you're using your voice, how you're showing up, not just with passion, but with purpose, and that you're not a noun, but you're a verb. You're in action. You know, you are movement in action. And I just appreciate you for that. I want to say thank you to our listeners today. And I hope that what you take away from here is that stories matter, that lived experience matters. And anytime you feel powerless, I encourage you to look into the mirror and remember the story that held you up. Remember the story that when you were floating on broken pieces brought you to shore. Remember the story that created community, and that very story that gave you comfort. Because what we do find inside of those stories is not only comfort, we find community, we find healing, and we find a way that we can turn that story from the story of self to the story of us, to the story of now that puts us in movement. And as Martin Luther King said, one of his favorite things, and I won't say the whole thing, but I love when he says, when he talks about the fierce urgency of now. And I have to say to you, now is the time to tell the story. Now is the time to build. Now is the time for Black people to be seen. Now is the time for us to be sitting at the table. Now is the time for policies to recognize us. Now is the time for media to be able to speak to the lived experience of Black people. Now is the time for our truth to be told. Now is the time for people to stand back and recognize that Black people have always been a part of the fabric of this nation. And if you want to heal the soul of the nation, then you've got to hear the story of Black people. So I want to thank you again for joining us. I look forward to working with you, Reverend English. And Crystal, I know she had to go, but Reverend English, I will be in contact. I encourage people to join the 1119 Restorative Justice. I saw some groups on there, and I know that they're familiar with restorative justice, which is also healing justice. And again, thank you so much for lending your voice to this conversation. I so greatly appreciate you, and I will be in touch.
I look forward to that. It's going to be a righteous, resourceful exchange.
Thank you. And to our audience, thank you for coming. We will have our next listening session. If Ben could put it, I'm terrible with dates. I believe it's October the 14th. That will be our Kentucky listening session. You can go to our website, blackappalachiancoalition.com, to see the next events that are coming up. If you would like to share your story, there is a link that can be placed in the chat. That's a Google form. You can fill that out and someone will be in contact with you for you to share your story. If you'd like to be a part of the Black Appalachian Coalition, you can also go to our website and just, complete the form that says ways that you want to get involved, or you can reach me at Bishop Marcia Dinkins. My email address is women, WOMEN, 4 FOR change @gmail.com. We also encourage you to go to our Facebook page and Twitter and Instagram and like and follow us, because you know what? We all are in this fight together. I wish you all a great afternoon and a great weekend ahead. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye-bye.